Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Roxy and I'm the Visitor Experience and Outreach Coordinator at the Lewis Latimer House Museum. For those who cannot see me, I'm an East Asian woman with short black hair, in a green shirt and scarf. I'm joined by our esteemed panelists tonight from the Weeksville Heritage Center, Erica Harper. Tonight we're here for the Black Historic Sites and Conversation series presented by the Lewis Latimer House Museum. Black Historic Sites and Conversation is a series of virtual talks in collaboration with different Black heritage sites and cultural centers in the greater New York City area about the ongoing work of preserving, interpreting, and celebrating Black history and historical figures. Tonight's program is supported by the Mellon Foundation. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hopes of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are on the ancestral lands of the Lenape people. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us here tonight. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. I'm going to share a few links in the chat about more information on the Lenape people. I would also like to take a minute to introduce our museum. So for those who have not visited, the house behind me in my background is how the Lewis Latimer House Museum looks like on a day in spring. Our museum was the home to Black inventor Lewis Latimer from 1903 to 1928 in Flushing, Queens. He contributed to modern technologies, including the early elevator system, bathrooms in railroad carts, which is the train, the telephone, and most notably, the carbon filament light bulb. So before we start, after my introduction, we will hear a presentation by the speaker, followed by a Q&A session. If you have any questions that you would like the panelists to answer, please feel free to share them through the Q&A function. We will likely be able to get to 10 to 12 questions depending on the time. There is also an option to upvote any questions should you see your question in the list. And as I mentioned before as well, the chat is open, so please feel free to comment and share your thoughts in the chat as the presentation goes. But just understand that we'll get to the questions at the Q&A session. So with all of that said, I want to quickly introduce our speaker tonight. Erica Harper is currently the Vice President of Learning and Engagement at Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, New York. In her role, she is responsible for the vision, strategy, and implementation for both the education and programming departments. This role is an honor and an accumulation of her 15 plus years in the field. Previously, Erica served as head of PK12 initiatives at the Phillips Collection, a museum of modern and contemporary art in Washington, D.C., where she provided vision and strategy for the museum-school partnerships. Also central to her work was ensuring that these programs were culturally responsive and supported diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. So with all that said, I'll now pass it to Erica.
Thank you, Roxy. Good evening, everyone. So excited to be here with you all tonight. Roxy cut down my bio just a little bit, so I want to add one thing that got left out, and that is I am an August-born Virgo sun. So I feel like that's a very important thing to share. No, I'm super excited to be here tonight. There are a lot of folks in the chat who have some familiarity with Weeksville, some folks who don't know anything about Weeksville at all. And so I hope that you all get something out of this as well. I will say I had the Herculean task of talking about sort of Weeksville history in 10 to 15 minutes. That is not easy for me if you know me. So we're going to kind of fly through some of this, but I hope that it inspires you all to come and see us here in Crown Heights to get a slower and more deep learning about the history of Weeksville. So I am going to share my screen, but as I get ready to do that, I have a question for you all, and I love if you could leave a response in the chat. And for those of you who are familiar, even if you aren't, my question is, when you think of Weeksville, what's the first word that comes to mind? I'll give folks a second as I share my screen. I see resilience, community, history, freedom, legacy, Black Brooklyn, preservation, Black excellence, historical community, Freeman, Black resistance, heritage. Love these, love these, love these. Keep putting those in the chat and I'm going to jump in. And a couple of you actually use my first word that always comes to mind when I think of Weeksville. And that word for me is community. Wendell Berry says that a proper community, we should remember also, is a commonwealth, a place, a resource, an economy. It answers the needs, practical as well as social and spiritual, of its members, among them the need to need one another. I found this quote when I was actually applying to this job at Weeksville as I was trying to find something to encapsulate what I had gotten from my research. And I think that this quote so encompasses the spirit of Weeksville and what at least I strive in my work and what my colleagues strive in their work to do is to make this a proper community, a place that serves everyone, meet people where they are, whether we are meeting your practical needs or your social and spiritual needs. Just briefly, Weeksville's vision is to be a leading authority in research for the scholarship, exploration, and dissemination of the history of Weeksville and other free Black communities, as well as the modern day artistic, intellectual, and social justice imperatives they exemplify and inspire. And we do that through a few ways. By illuminating this pivotal aspect of Black history, by empowering our visitors with the tools, trainings, and education that they need, by celebrating and centering Black culture, community, and creativity, and hopefully sparking dialogue and collaborations between local residents, artists, academics, and activists that advance us towards a more just and equitable world. So now, where did Weeksville come from? All right, a little bit of a history lesson. So in 1800, and this was a fact that I was so shocked to learn. I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee, so below the Mason-Dixon line. And growing up, you always learn that there was no slavery in the North, right? That is the narrative. In 1800, Brooklyn was known as the slaveholding capital of New York State and was home to the highest concentration of enslaved folks north of the Mason-Dixon line. I'm gonna let y'all sit with that for a second because that really blew me away when I first heard that quote and then saw what those numbers were. And some numbers I've seen has more enslaved folks here in Brooklyn than in some places in South Carolina. So the Panic of 1837 happens in the city and wealthy landowners start to liquidate their assets and their holdings. A Black man named Henry C. Thompson purchases 32 lots of land from John Lefferts, whose family estate comprised of most of what we know as present-day Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. James Weeks then purchases 2 of those lots from Henry C. Thompson in 1838 and builds his home near what is currently Schenectady and Dean Street. Weeksville eventually becomes named after James Weeks. But I want to back up for just a second. And there's a very important thing to note here. At that time in New York State, if you were a Black man who owned $250 worth of property, then you had the right to vote. Unfortunately, as we know, women don't come into this picture for much later, and there was no such land requirement for white men. But what does that mean then? That means that if you buy a plot of land in Weeksville, you now have the right to vote, right? And so the one thing I want you to remember from all the things I'm going to say in this 10 minutes is that Weeksville was an intentional community. And part of that intention was to enfranchise Black people. It was not sort of a happenstance that sprouted up. It was always with the goal of getting Black folks the right to vote, because with enfranchisement then comes power over how your life is lived, getting to be a part of the decisions that are made. And so at that time, Brooklyn is also, I would say it's like Brooklyn was still the country at that time, very secluded, and especially where Weeksville was, it was geographically separated from a lot of Brooklyn. And what that did was that seclusion then ensured some refuge. And not only that, it allowed this community to build up its own access to education, economic self-sufficiency, and political self-determination. Those are pillars that you build a strong and powerful community on. Weeksville boasted at that time the highest rate of property and business ownership in any African-American urban community at the time, and was home to lots of strong community institutions like schools. So Color School #2, that's founded in 1840, after the Civil War becomes PS 68, which is the first integrated school in the country, started right here in Weeksville. Also very strong establishments like churches. So Berean Baptist Church is founded in 1850 in Weeksville, and Bethel Tabernacle founded in 1847. Other, like Weeksville also even had its own baseball team called the Unknowns. In addition to that, other powerful sort of cultural organizations sprung up in Weeksville, places like the African Civilization Society that worked to establish a colony of free Black folks in Liberia. And also, shout out to the women of Weeksville, folks like Sarah Garnett, who created the Equal Suffrage League, which advocated for the right to vote for Black women. Weeksville also had its own newspaper. And I want you to sort of just for some context, right? It's 1838 in New York. Most of the rest of the country is still enslaved. And so you have folks who live in the Weeksville community who are not just who weren't free Blacks, wealthy landowners. You had people all across the spectrum, some of those being folks who had escaped slavery from the South. And so the Freedmen's Torchlight, I love to say, served two roles, right? As a newspaper, because you could find advertisements for homes and jobs and things like that. You could find speeches about enfranchisement, ending slavery elsewhere, but also it served as a textbook. And when we talk about community and meeting community needs, right? Some folks didn't learn how to read because they had been enslaved. And so as you see on the cover of the Torchlight, we have the alphabet, right? So we're meeting if I show you the flip side, you see a very long proclamation about suffrage. So meeting everyone where they are. Weeksville, I'm skipping over a lot of history here, and hopefully that's my teaser to get you in here. So Weeksville thrives through most of the 19th century. But by 1880, Brooklyn starts to grow up and around Weeksville. The Brooklyn Bridge had been built when Weeksville is first established. It is. Eastern Parkway is built right through the town, which sort of brings a whole different energy to Brooklyn. And so what had been this really tight-knit community begins to disperse into other parts of Brooklyn, into Manhattan, and Weeksville becomes largely forgotten, except for a few remnants. So in 1968, two researchers from Pratt find mention of this Black community that existed called Weeksville. And they said, let's go try and find it. One of them happened to be a pilot, so they got in a plane and looked for Weeksville from the sky. And what they discovered was the strange footprint of four homes that seemed completely out of place. They were facing a different direction from the main road, and they just seemed odd. So they came down out of the plane, came to find the houses, and discovered that these four homes were the last remaining remnants of homes of Weeksville that lived, they called them the Hunter Fly Road homes because Hunter Fly Road went right through the Weeksville community. Also want to give a nod to Hunter Fly Road was a Lenape trading route before it was Weeksville, right? And so those same connections run all through New York. So begins Weeksville's next chapter once they discover these homes. In 1969, Joan Maynard creates the Society for the Preservation of Weeksville and Bedford-Stuyvesant History with the goal of discovering and preserving Weeksville's past and to restore the Hunter Fly Road homes. The homes get landmarked by New York City in 1970 and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1971. And then begins what is a huge community effort. You'll often hear people referring to the dig when they talk about Weeksville. And that was at that time, they actually started to dig up the ground and see what they could discover. And one of the coolest things about that was everyone from the community came out to help with that effort. Boy Scouts, students from 243, community members, government officials, everyone was sort of involved in this process of rediscovering and preserving this historic Black community. Weeksville Heritage Center opens officially in 2005, and the expanded center that I am doing this talk from tonight opens in 2014. See just some photos of some of the work that was done in the preservation of the houses. And this is a photograph of John Maynard, who are always referred to as the patron saint of Weeksville. And one of the most important things for John in restoring these homes and opening up for everyone was to make Black folks especially feel proud of where they come from, and especially Black children. She wanted to open these homes for tourists so they could come and learn about their history, their legacy, and be proud. And we owe so much to Joan Maynard and her efforts and the efforts of everyone involved in the early society of preservation of Weeksville and Memphis lives and history. Jumping really quickly forward to present day, we do a little bit of everything here at Weeksville. We have a variety of programming from our green market to our huge Juneteenth food festival, which some of you probably know a little bit about. We do theater shows. We have an exhibition space, so an art gallery. You can rent out our space. Literally any and everything we can do in this space. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about one of the things that makes me feel the best, and I think hopefully makes Joan Maynard proud, is the work that we continue to do with students here in the space and exposing them to the legacy of Weeksville and hopefully making them feel proud of who they are and where they come from. And I want to close with a little, well, there'll be lots of time for questions. I know I went through the history really quickly, but I want to just close this part of the presentation with a poem from a student from PS 243 in 1975. Do you know why I'm special? Because I live in a special place that Black people lived a long time ago, a place called Weeksville, where they are doing digs, digging deep in the ground, finding artifacts, some big, some small, some square, some round. Do you know why I'm special? Because my family loves me and tells me all about who I am and my family tree that grew in Weeksville and is growing through me. Celeste Lumpkins, age 8, the Weeksville School, 1975. So I'll stop there with just that part of the presentation. And I'm sure you all will have lots of questions about all the history that I skipped, and I'll do my best to answer as much and as many as I can.
Thank you so much for sharing, Erica, and also for that poem at the end. I think it really touched me because thinking about like just the perspective of the child who wrote it. I wonder how she is now. But I think it really captures the essence of what you're talking about of doing education work in general, but also especially in Weeksville. So I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A yet. But I very quickly is I saw a question about someone asking about the PowerPoint. Would it be possible for you to share it, or you think you have to think about it a little bit?
I have to think about it a little bit just because I
Okay.
haven't put all necessary bibliography and everything in there, but I will see if I can share. I'm checking with our
Yeah.
collections department.
Yeah, so we'll get back to you on that, Laura. Thank you so much for your question. And so I'm seeing now we do have a question in the Q&A. Um the question is, what is the sister's name that started the preservation?
Joan Maynard.
And there are also a number of questions, but I think I'm going to try and start maybe with this question. Someone asked, where did the people who lived in Weeksville go?
Some of them didn't go anywhere. They're still here in Brooklyn. Or at least their ancestors are still here in Brooklyn. But just as the city starts to grow, right, people kind of just spread out, parts of Manhattan, other parts of Brooklyn. So I always say it's not like Weeksville didn't break up because of gentrification in the ways that we think today, but more opportunity was happening. More, the city was developing and growing in different ways, and people just start to explore those opportunities, which took them away from this tight-knit community that they had shared.
Trying to see, because I do think that that question touches also a little bit about maybe some misconception or lesser known aspects of the site. But I wonder, are there any other common misconceptions that you come across, or just things that you wish more people know about regarding Weeksville?
Yes, the homes are often referred to as the slave houses. And so I always, when I talk to people about that, one, just sort of explaining that history of like slavery being abolished in New York before anywhere else in the country. This is also like history I never learned being a Southern child, right? Like I never knew that in this state folks weren't enslaved. Um, and so important to have people understand that there were free Black folks here. There were folks who had been enslaved and folks not. So a whole mix of folks in the community, but the homes were not the homes of enslaved folks. Weeksville was a free Black community.
And based on that, because you mentioned that the community came together in the initial preservation efforts as well, there's this question that I think ties very beautifully with that as well. They ask, can you share a little bit about where did this preservation initiative get this funding from? I wonder if this is in reference to before or now, but maybe you can talk a little if you know about previously and also now.
Yeah, I think the surprisingly, we got a lot of money from the government at that time, but like local government. And so that's one thing, and not even the biggest part. From me and you, right? From regular folks who were given their $1, their $5, um, a lot of door knocking, a lot of campaigns, but honestly, probably the largest chunk of the money for preserving the community of the houses came from regular folks like us. Not necessarily, $1 million donors or whatever the equivalent of a million would have been back at that time. But really small donations made a big difference in preserving those homes. And
And
today,
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
no, I forgot. I'll throw in today we get money from a number of sources, grants, some money from the city, but also those individual donations are still so important to the preservation of Weeksville.
So there are these two questions that kind of tie to each other. So first, I see one question in the Q&A asking, what are the boundary streets of Weeksville? I grew up in Brooklyn, but didn't learn that this was an historic district until adulthood. I grew up on Dean Street. Um,
I knew someone was going to ask me that one. I should have had it pulled up because I can never remember. Troy, East New York. I'm not going to remember the other two. Give me a second and I will look up and come back and tell you the exact boundaries.
no worries.
Which
And
ones?
we did have another question following up from previously. So someone asked, there are still living members who live in the houses. There was a woman who grew up in the biggest house and talked about the magic of living there. Do you know any other folks who grew up or were members of those remaining homes? Yeah.
If you know any, please let me know because I would love to talk to them and record their oral histories. The woman who you're probably referring to lived in what would have been, so at the time that Joan Maynard buys the historic homes, there was still a family living there in the Williams family home. And so a lot of what we know about them and the home, we actually got directly from them and through oral histories that we have. Um, we have not, to my knowledge, found any living members who we're in contact with. So I will put that out there. If anyone does know any, please send them our way. Would love to be able to record their histories and their stories about their time in Weeksville. I think one of the biggest and most important things that I like to impress upon is telling our own stories, right? Because if we don't tell our own stories, other folks will do that for us, for better or for worse. And so yes, if you know anyone or any living descendants or relatives, please send them our way.
So I know that folks have been using both the Q&A and also the chat to ask your questions. So I apologize if I skip through your question, and we'll try to get to each one of them if possible. So I'm since this is really related to the last question, are there other homes around that were previously part of Weeksville that are still standing?
To my knowledge and my research, there are now three, but I'll tell you about that in a second. The four Hunter Fly Road homes are the only remaining homes or remnants of historic Weeksville. Um, Quick asterisk on that is there are now three of those homes that are original. One of the homes burned down in the 1980s. And so we have rebuilt the facade of the home. And inside is an exhibition that some of you, especially librarians and whatnot in the chat, in the room, know about, an exhibition called In Pursuit of Freedom, which was a large effort of a lot of different institutions in Brooklyn Public Library, Weeksville, other spots. And so we have an exhibition in that space called In Pursuit of Freedom that looks at the history of Weeksville, and sort of Weeksville and sort of the country at large, as well as dives into the stories of about eight really important figures to Weeksville history, like Sarah Garnett, who we saw in my presentation.
Speaking of that, there was an earlier question about churches in the district. And I know that in your presentation, there were the two churches. I wonder, were those the only ones, or were there other ones as well? Or how was the residents' relationship like to those places of worship? Are there any like documentation of that?
Super important. Actually, the Williams family that I mentioned briefly, we know that they were super active in their church. Church was like one of those central institutions for Black folks at that time. And some would say even still today. And so those churches that you saw in the presentation are still standing. One is right across the street from our center, and looks almost exactly the same. The other is right down the block from us. So those buildings are still here, still standing. But yes, I mean, the Black church, in a lot of ways that it is even presently today, were central sort of meeting, gathering, organizing spaces for the people of Weeksville.
And this really ties to this question as well. Someone asked, are there instances of residents in Weeksville who were leaders in the abolition movement? And then tying to that, someone in the Q&A asked, with Weeksville providing refuge for those escaping enslavement in the South, could you share the role the community played in protecting Black people seeking safety during the draft riots of 1863?
Thank you, whoever threw that question. And I was hoping that it came up because I didn't get to put it in my presentation. Wait, Roxy, what was the first part of that?
The first part is asking if there are any Weeksville residents that were leaders of the abolition movement, but I think they're both tied. So I asked in that way. Yeah.
One, yes, definitely. Henry C. Thompson, even who I mentioned, sort of bought those initial plots of land that James Weeks bought from, was an abolitionist. Folks like Julius Morrell, who were super important to the Weeksville story, actually wrote for Douglas's North Star. Argue for abolition all across the country. I mean, even, women who were involved in the abolitionist movement. Yes, a lot of early Weeksville residents and on through time were a part of the abolition movement. Now, we on our site don't have any evidence of, sort of Underground Railroad tunnels or anything like that, but we do know that there were other places sort of right outside of Weeksville, sort of the space that we inhabit now between Buffalo and Bergen, that were stops for slaves escaping freedom further north. And so then get to the draft riots, right? So draft riots, draft massacre happens. Remember, there's no Brooklyn Bridge left. So the only way to even get over here, because remember, we are secluded in Brooklyn and Weeksville, is by boat. And so folks come over in droves and boats, and the folks of Weeksville open their homes. They open their, in addition to churches and schools, there were hospitals. There was a home for the aged here, uh, a home for orphan children, sort of all those really important institutions you need to build a strong community were here. All those spaces open up their doors to welcome in residents to help people, tend to people's wounds and things like that. Some of those folks never went back to Manhattan. They stayed in Brooklyn and in Weeksville. And some did go back. The historical fiction book Liberty actually has a part that talks about that, as well as Dr. Susan Smith McKinney, who was one of the first female Black doctors in the country, but also had her practice right here in Weeksville. And she is mentioned in that book, and also they talk about the draft riots from a historical fiction perspective.
Are there other resources to learn a little more about this aspect of Weeksville's history that folks can reference?
Yeah, and I don't know if Judith is still here in the chat, but there's a book called Brooklyn's Promised Land, written by Judith Wellman, that is sort of everything you want to know about Weeksville history. Judith has done a wonderful job of putting it all into that book. You can soon, not just yet, but soon come to Weeksville and work with our archives, and also get a chance to sort of just do digging on your own. And then, I always just recommend folks sign up for our newsletter, and even our social media accounts, where we also share just a little bit of history. There was a great one that our marketing manager shared around Christmas time. Like, he was like, I'm sending my like $1 donation into Weeksville. It's so important and special for me, all handwritten. So
And it's interesting because in the chat I'm seeing from Raul, who is with Friends of Abolitionist Place, I believe, and he mentioned that with the book Ellen Hawley, the great granddaughter of Dr. Susan Smith McKinney, hated that book. So
I know
I
Raul.
yeah yeah.
Hi, Raul. It was, I just didn't, I was like, we'll talk offline. I have thoughts about the book as well that I will not share in the public arena. But we could talk about that offline, Raul. Thank you, Suzanne. Suzanne's our collections manager, who dropped in the boundaries of Weeksville in the chat for the person who had asked that earlier. Thank you, Suzanne.
Yeah, let me, because I think it's only a comment for us. So I'm sending it to everyone now. So the comment that I posted in the chat, it is from Suzanne, just for everyone's reference. Um so but then returning to that, we do have other questions. So we talked about the two churches, but someone asked, are those two churches in near Weeksville or in Weeksville labeled as historical, like the Abyssinian, I'm so sorry for butchering it, Baptist Church in Harlem?
Here's where we're gonna use I just moved to Brooklyn card. So I don't know exactly how, what the status of the Abyssinian church is in Harlem. But I know one of the churches I showed you is a historic site, I believe is also landmark. So I want to say yes, but yes, with the check me on that one.
And we had an earlier question. I'm so sorry for losing that earlier question. Oh, actually, yes. This it's really related as well because we have folks from other sites that are in the Zoom today. But someone asked, are there particular organizations slash historic sites nationwide that you consider sister sites?
I'm going to use I'm laughing because I'm going to use a line from my president and CEO, Dr. Raymond Carrington, who says that there is no other place like Weeksville. And we say that because when we think about contemporary Weeksville, right, that we have these historic homes, that we have a green space in the middle of Crown Heights, which is a gem, that we have sort of this building that we're able to do programming and things like that in. Sort of, we are a little bit of everything: art gallery, rental space, green space, historic homes. We do educational tours. I do want to say that while we at Weeksville have physical remnants of our historic homes and the history and legacy of Weeksville, that does not take away from like the countless untold historic Black communities that have been completely wiped off the map and disappeared, that we will never know their names. And so I think here in New York, places like Seneca Village, places like San Juan Hill, that is now Lincoln Center. And so while I proudly say there is no other place like Weeksville, there are so many Black communities that we will never know about because they have been erased. And Weeksville, if not for those four homes, possibly would have been erased from my memories and history as well.
And there was a contextual question that was asked. Someone asked, what were the draft riots?
In 1863, put my teacher hat on really quickly. Abraham Lincoln starts to draft. Thank you, Raul is on it. Thank you. Abraham Lincoln sort of starts a draft. You also have a lot of Irish immigrants that are here in at the time, and so what begins is like a refusal to fight in the Civil War. Chaos sparks in Manhattan that starts as anti-police and quickly becomes anti-Black, anti anyone who is not white. And so, I mean, it is by name the draft riots. I try to remember the college draft massacre because it was, it was not a equal, fair fight. The end, a little fiction, right? But the end of the gangs of New York actually is the beginning of the draft riot. So you can even find, you like YouTube, the riot scene in the gangs of New York, and that just gives you like a visual of what that was like. I do think they do a good job of giving you the visual, like, and visceral feeling of what the riots must have been like to be involved in.
And I think with all that said, I know there are two other questions relating to the recording and also any events, but we'll touch on that towards the end for announcements. And I promise you I'll get to you all for the recordings because we actually post those on YouTube. So and actually Raul who is in the chat was also a guest speaker from Friends of Abolitionist Place. So actually with that question that was asked, and I'm sorry for jumping back to the previous question. I really see that in Brooklyn there are a lot of different people that are fighting to preserve different Black heritage sites or historical sites. So yeah, so if you can check, we will check out those, or I will share the link so you can check out the previous recordings. But I want to talk a little more about maybe the present, and because in the talk description and I'm going to go back really quickly. It's so this was a question because we always invite the guest speakers to help us write the description of the talk, and under there you wrote, what role do institutions serve in our communities and what role should they serve? How do we expand and reimagine the boundaries of museums and other cultural spaces? So I really want to actually ask you those questions. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on, how do you define, museums and cultural spaces and why the expand or why the reimagine? Yeah.
Yeah. It's so funny when I sent those questions, I was like, yeah, big questions. And then I was like, oh, now I have to talk about these things. So I will start by saying I do not have an answer, right? I don't think there is a one answer for this, right? Um, I was working in an art museum in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. And I think we saw sort of a cultural response to that moment that looked very different depending on what kind of spaces that you were in. And it made me think a lot about what is the job of a museum in contemporary times, right? At an art museum, obviously people can come in, see art, and it's beautiful, and that has value. Um, but I saw a lot of museums and institutions starting to insert themselves in spaces where they weren't before, or being vocal about things that they weren't before. And it's just sort of like, is that the job of a museum or institution? And when do they enter into those spaces? Um, I don't know that we ever got to the answer at the art museum. However, when I came to Weeksville, I think that became like even more important and something I still think about a lot. As I mentioned, for all the different parts that we have, rental, art gallery, house tours, we also have a community. Like, we are smack dab in the middle of Crown Heights, right? And so there's a community right around us that has very like present practical needs, right? So we talked about, back to that quote about community serving our practical needs, but also those spiritual and other needs that folks might have. And so I think a space like Weeksville that serves community is just that, right? It is almost not even a space like, it's not mine, it's not my colleagues, it is all of ours, right? And so how are we addressing the needs of the folks that we serve? And that might look like, having food at an event. It might look like bringing fresh fruits and vegetables to Crown Heights at one location where folks can come and get that at a discounted rate. It might look like, I don't know, open up the space so folks can come and wash clothes. I've never done that yet. It's something I've been thinking about. But I think it is a duty and responsibility to serve the communities in which you sit. And so much so for Weeksville, because we wouldn't be here without community. Back to the dig, back to John Maynard and the early society's efforts, back to those $1 and $5 donations. We are only here because people have sustained us. Even in 2019 with the Save Weeksville campaign, a lot of what kept our doors open was the people that we serve. And I think it is sort of a duty and responsibility of Weeksville to then give that community what it needs. I think that's similarly for a lot of spaces. And sometimes that means we have to figure out how to do things differently. We might have to change our goals and our focuses. Maybe we're putting a little too much energy in this space and we need to think about what it looks like to support people over here. Are we making sure that we're meeting all our audiences? Are we addressing our seniors as well as our youth and everyone in between? I think it requires a lot of heart. And I don't know that any of us are in museums or working in these spaces because we don't care. They are not paying seven figures, but if you are in a museum that's paying seven figures, let me know where you are. But I think we do it for the love, right? And that's an important piece of it. And with that, right, comes asking the hard questions, having hard conversations, opening up space for opinions that are different from your own. I think like museums have this power to be those things, even if it is just opening your doors for folks to have a conversation, right, that is meeting a need. And how do we become sort of a beacon for those things, a space where everyone feels like it is theirs? I always say when folks come here for a program, ask people to raise their hand if it's their first time at Weeksville. And I say it every time and I mean it every time. I truly hope you feel at home here, right? And so like, I know what home feels like for me and what it means to me. I need to know what home feels like for the folks that I'm serving here too, so we can make sure that we're doing those things. And I think like whether it's through our education or our programming or what we're doing in our collections and archives, what we're doing in our outdoor space, all those things are important to consider how we are serving folks.
There is a comment and also a question from the same person. So I'm just going to read it really quickly because I think it really ties to what you're saying too. Someone said, this needs to be done once a month. We need to be reminded of this often as we are losing Black residents in the surrounding areas. And they also asked, have you been able to do work with the surrounding projects and will you bring back the summer concerts?
I was just responding to Cyril. I hope I'm saying that right. Yes, we were. I was just talking about the summer concerts in the meeting today. Those happened before I got this job, and it's one thing I've been hearing a lot about. So absolutely. And yes, we have our neighbors in Kingsborough housing development right across the street. Kingsborough actually had a holiday party here in our space. And so working with them to continue to figure out what do you need, right? Because it isn't just us deciding what folks around us need. It's like actually going and asking and doing the work with those folks in community to make sure that we're meeting those needs.
And based on that, I saw this question in the chat and I think it ties a little bit also to your work. Someone asked, how is it possible that Weeksville was almost forgotten, but also that what is the current work that's being done in helping to educate people on it? So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Weeksville sort of like falls from the public record, like mentions of it in the public record around 1930. And so it's sort of like that, if you don't use it, you forget it kind of thing. I just think the name Weeksville, right, sort of gets absorbed into Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. People are using those names for the neighborhoods and just not historic Weeksville. I will tell you, when I was moving to Brooklyn for this job and I went on to Street Easy to start to look for apartments, Weeksville was listed as a neighborhood, right? And I think that also speaks to, I mean, a little bit of gentrification, right? People understand like, oh, people know this as historic community. That might be a pull to get people in. This is my guess, just my guess. Because I haven't seen it pop up on the maps like that, but I thought it was interesting that in the real estate space, they were calling it Weeksville again. I'm going to stop that before I soapbox and tangent about real estate and things like that. what are we doing present day? Everything that we can. Suzanne, who was in the chat, I'm not sure if she's still here, is working really hard to get our collections together. We have everything from houses, right, that are part of our collection, documents, tons and tons of documents, quilts, objects. We have a number of things in our collection. And so Suzanne is doing the hard and important work of sort of cataloging all of that, figuring out, how we preserve those things. And then someone asked earlier, no, we do not have everything digitized yet. Something that we are working on, need some funding for. So if you all know someone, send that our way. Listen, we still need funding. I think like people think like, oh, Weeksville, had the campaign, they got saved, they're now a cultural institutions group, they're good. No, we're not. We still need all the support that we can, so that we don't ever end up in a space where we may have to close the doors of Weeksville, or like this history won't get to be something that's very alive and very present.
There's another comment, it's from Shauna, who said, "It's so easy to forget that Brooklyn has been Black for a long time and we're losing our communities." I agree with Cyril. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Keep the history alive. So, I wanted to bring up this comment also in reference to what you're saying about collections because, just a quick point that Lewis Latimer actually lived in Brooklyn before he moved to this house in Queens. His actual address is 184 Adelphi Street, and it's in Fort Greene. And he lived there for a sizable amount of time. I think he was there from at least the mid 1890s to 1902 because he moved into this house in 1903. So we really think that Brooklyn has been home to a lot of Black residents um, back with Weeksville, but even with someone like Lewis Latimer, who again, like I think the history is something that is not as well known as it should be. But that we know these things also through a lot of the work done by our collections, not our museum's collection staff, but just collection staff in general, right? Like having access to those things is also super important. Um, and speaking of, because I know we have a number of we're also looking for funding for digitizing our collection. So I definitely hear you on the struggles
Yeah.
to, with trying to sustain this work because there's so many aspects to museum work. And you talked about education, you talked about programming, not only, like from the staff perspective, but also integrating community feedback. That's something that we're also trying to do as well here. And myself, I'm multilingual, so that's also, in consideration of the community that's in Flushing now, but also that Flushing is also historically Black community, and it still is. There are a lot of Black residents that make up the community that saved the house, along with Louis Latimer's grandchildren themselves. So with all that said, um, I think we are also approaching the last 9 minutes of the program. And I just wanted to make sure, because just quickly, so sorry, let me just look through here.
While you're looking, I wanted to give a quick shout out to
Yeah.
Shauna also, and just
Yes.
mention that there are a lot of folks, and Roxy, just some of the work that we're doing, sort of in these little coalitions, who are really working to tie these Black institutions together. Shauna works at Flatbush, is part of Flatbush African Burial Ground efforts. We have a little group that I will wait to mention because I don't know if we're ready to let everyone know yet, but who are working really hard to make connections between these spaces. I mean, we're talking about all these, Lewis Latimer lived in Brooklyn, right? I'm starting to realize the more I research, the more I uncover how all these folks are connected and have been working together, right? And so you can imagine, what does it look like if we have, sort of a Black historic trail through Brooklyn, right? Or people know about all these different sites. And I know the In Pursuit of Freedom efforts were also working towards that, right? How do we link these spaces? How are we working together? There's hardly any work that I do that does not involve partnership. So happy that Lewis Latimer invited me to do this talk tonight. And I think like these sorts of things are incredibly important because we can help each other preserve our stories as well. And so shout out to everyone who is working really hard to do that work, Raoul and 227 place, 227 Abolitionist place, and other spots around in and around Brooklyn to help preserve these really, really important histories.
And I also want to shout out because with the museum, actually we've been inviting different sites to be a part of this talk. So Raul was one of the guest speakers, and I again promised I'll send you all the YouTube link for the series. But I want to shout out the Queens Library Archives because with the museum we're partially closed at the moment because we're installing a new permanent exhibition. But a lot of the collection's objects, Louis Latimer's granddaughter, Miss Winifred, she actually like left some of those collections items with the Queen's Library Archives. So, but then some of them will also be brought to the museum for our permanent exhibition. So, stay tuned for that for when we reopen in May. But also that you're actually welcome to go to the archives to check out those collections items as well. But unfortunately, they're not digitized for those who would want to look into it. But with all that said, I really do want to start to wrap up, maybe do like a quick conclusion for tonight. We talked about a lot of things, and maybe we didn't get to talk about everything. But Erica, how do you feel about your work and with we're also approaching Black History Month, which we understand for sites like us, every month is Black History Month.
Yes.
But yeah, how do you reconcile with that and also understanding the state of education of Black history in the country? That's a really big question, but I'll pass it to you.
Dang. And Roxy, you might be, I was like, I can make it through this talk without crying. Anyone who's heard me talk before, kind of, I'm always tearing up. And that's because like this work is so important. And I just feel very honored one to be able to be able to do this work in a place as special as Weeksville, to get to share history that I didn't learn and that I'm learning that even folks right here in Brooklyn had no idea about. And so we always say here, we are just stewards. We are here to keep it going. It will be here long after I am. And so I'm just grateful to be here in this time, in this space, and have the opportunity to do this work. And I think even more so in the current climate, when history books are saying that enslaved folks were happy to be there and they were workers, when we can't teach or even say things in Florida schools, right? And watching a trickle down of those things all over our nation makes this work that all of us are doing so incredibly important and so incredibly relevant. And back to my mention of, if we don't tell our own stories, they will either not tell them at all, or they will tell the stories that center them and not us, and not the work of the folks who we are trying to bring light to. And so I think we're all lucky to get to do this work in this space. It's so important. And I think it will continue to be important. It's important for us to bond together so that we can push these efforts of like saving and preserving and telling this history, to fight the misinformation, to fight the like erasure. Like we're talking about historic Black communities that we never know the names of because they have been disappeared. Those efforts are still in place today to try to erase these things from history and distort them to tell a different narrative. And so I think it just makes the work that we're doing right now that much, much more important. And we need more folks doing it. So
Thank you so much for sharing that and for holding it so close to your heart and sharing that with us too. And I asked that question because it is, I think I feel the sentiment as well, of I'm not a Black person, but like as a person of color, like and also as an immigrant, we face a lot of these kind of not only erasure, but like really true oppression. I mean,
yes,
there's different varying variety of that. But to your point, I think regardless of our identities, we all can take part in this work, and we should really center that as well. So with all that said,
wait, Rox,
we yes, go
before you
ahead,
close this,
Erica.
no, sorry, before you close this, thank you for saying that. And I think that's so important for folks. Like I always say, Weeksville, like the center is Black, right? Like generally we're a Black historic site, but also we center Black folks in the Black experience. But there's room for everyone in there. And our stories, like we are so much more alike as humans than we are different. And sometimes it just takes like, wiping the eyes, cleaning the glasses a little bit to be like, oh, wait, you too, right? We also have these similar experiences. And so I just want to thank you for saying that, and just I wanted to uplift that. And to everyone in the chat who is not Black, this is a space for you too. Like these sites that we talk about, Black historic sites, this is American history. It's history that we all need to know, and it will help us become a better nation and just like better people generally. So thank you for seeing that and uplifting that part, Roxy.
Yeah, because I feel like a lot of people have that misconception that like, if I'm not Black, why do I care? But I think that's actually really a disservice to yourself because
Yes.
it's true history. And I think I really see that also as it's a history of resistance.
Yes.
So, we and there's the truth, which is right, like it's something that means very personally to people. Like I'm an immigrant, so again, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna go too much into all of this, I promise. But so sometimes it's hard to get the education, but then once we learn about these things, I think it starts to give so much perspective of how this country operates, and it gives a
Yes.
perspective about things in the present as well. So we should definitely not neglect that. And try to educate ourselves, while also people around us. And hopefully this talk could again be a continuation of that effort. So with all of that said, guys, and we'll continue to make sense of these things together in the series. We are approaching the end of announcements here, and the two questions in the Q&A actually serve perfectly into this section. So someone asked, are there any upcoming events for Black History Month? Again, I'm so sorry. That question is also a very valid question, but I'm just gonna go quickly. For us, we do have a number of programs. We have Illuminating Histories, which is an ongoing series. And we unfortunately on site don't have any programs, but I will send a quick link in the chat for you guys to take a look. And I also found the one for Weeksville. If Erica, you want to talk a little about your programming for February.
I'm gonna give y'all are getting the first. This isn't even out in marketing yet, so I'm gonna say it fast. But check our website, sign up for the newsletter. You'll get all of these. On February 10th, we're opening an exhibition called 40 Acres Weeksville. That was recently at the Shed. If you just type in 40 Acres Weeksville, you should be able to pop up some information about that. Shout out to artist Sandy Williams, who did that project. On February 17th, we are having okay, wait, sorry. I don't want to get the dates wrong. Okay, February 17th, we're having a day in the spirit of the Black radical tradition. We're going to have two film screenings, one called Conversations, the Black Radical Tradition, another called I Heard It Through the Grapevine, which focuses on James Baldwin in the post-Civil War era, sort of going from the North to the South, talking about why these things are so relevant and important. On February 24th, we're going to have Name to be determined Weeksville quiz show. So all of y'all folks who are in the chat who clearly know a lot, or you think you know Black history, we're gonna have a really fun quiz show game where we will crown our Weeksville quiz show champion for the year. And then we are wrapping up the year with something I'm really excited about. We do a book series called Torchlight Talks, where we have a talk with an author. Do I have the book? I just so happen to have the book right here in my bag, not on purpose. And on February 29th, we are going to talk about the gist of Bidwis with author Lamont Jones. And that's actually going to be a card night. So a little bit of tutorial on Bidwis, not a full one, but a little bit. And then we'll open it up for you to play whatever kind of cards that you like. But really looking forward to talking to Lamont about the connections between the Pullman Porters and other folks and how they use cards at that time. So, I mean, you are probably also exhausted already, like I am, Roxy. I mean, also just repeat something else you said. Y'all, we are here 365, not just February. So please don't forget about us once February is done, because all of these spaces are doing amazing programs all year long.
Yeah, and make sure I actually shared both the Weeksville and also our museum's programming page in the chat. So please make sure to check that out. And with that said, we are going to wrap up tonight. Thank you all so much for coming to the talk, and thank you, Erica, for sharing and for your for everything, the presentation, the vulnerability, the strength, the knowledge. Yeah, and so stay tuned, everyone, and we'll see you around. Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Roxy. Bye,
Have a good
everybody.
night.